Seed oils are toxic. Seed oils are responsible for all modern ailments, from cardiovascular disease to cancer to Alzheimer's. It's all because we're consuming seed oils. The evidence doesn't support that at all.
Professor Sarah Berry is one of the UK's leading experts in nutrition, a researcher at King's College London and the chief scientist at Zoe. But today she is going to be on the podcast talking about the truth behind glucose spikes, what you actually need to know about seed oils, and navigating misinformation when it comes to nutrition on social media.
There are some good nutritionists and some good dietitians putting out good information, but loudest voices, unfortunately, a lot of it's nutribolic. My most confident years and my happiest years in myself have been in my 40s, because I don't give a shit if someone thinks I said something stupid. We live in this time of protein obsession. There is on social media a lot of misinformation. Trend that I think we're going to see emerging, which is not nutribolics, is
Before we get into the conversation with Professor Sarah, please, if you could just subscribe or leave a 5-star review. It really, really helps us continue the podcast and bring in you guests that can help you live a happier, healthier life. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Professor Sarah Berry and welcome to Her Discussions podcast.
Professor Sarah, our community have sent in so many questions about glucose spikes, nutrition, how to have a nutritious diet when you're a really, really busy woman. And I cannot wait to get into all of those. But first, I would love to just hear what brought you into the world of nutrition and why is it something that's so important to you?
I think it's because I love research. So it's not necessarily nutrition per se, although nutrition is very exciting. It's something that's relevant to everyone. What does everyone in the world do? We eat. Yes, it's highly relevant, but it's the science. It's the research process. I'm a research active scientist. I love running clinical trials. The excitement I get from thinking of a research question, developing a study design, a protocol, to how I'm going to test it, to then even the boring stuff like getting ethics approval for running a trial, recruiting participants, because I mainly do human clinical trials, thinking about the intervention, what is it I'm going to test, what are the outcomes I'm going to look at, then the really exciting bit, getting the data at the end, analysing the data and seeing, have I answered my research question? You know, is that fat better than that fat for you? Does this supplement work? And so forth. And it's that whole process that is so exciting. And I've run now 35 randomised control trials. It never, ever bores me. Now, obviously, nutrition itself is also really exciting. And we know so little still, I think, about nutrition. We know enough, I think, to make very healthy choices. But I think it's also a really exciting area to be in because we're learning so much. And it's such a rapidly evolving area of not just science, but actually what's out there. You know, when I started out in my nutrition career, which was, more than 25 years ago, nearly 30 years ago, the food landscape was totally different, even since I started my career. So it's something that's never going to get old.
Incredible answer. Being at the forefront of all these really interesting discussions, you know, literally doing the experiments. But I'd imagine nutrition, studying nutrition and researching nutrition poses its own, lots of difficulties. I'd imagine it's very, very difficult to create controlled environments when it comes to nutrition. How do you mitigate all those different confounding factors when you're doing your research?
I love that question because it means I get to talk about the whole research process. And it's a great question because running clinical trials is beset with challenges. I think there is no perfect nutrition clinical trial. There's a perfect pharmacological trial because you can give a tablet and you can give a placebo. But how do you blind, i.e. how do you mask one dietary intervention from another dietary intervention? Except in the case of supplements, it's really, really challenging. You know, how do you account for other factors that are really important in nutrition studies, such as what is it you're displacing by what you're adding in? So if I want to look, for example, at the health effects of nuts, which is what I've studied a lot, I can't just say to you, okay, here, go and have, 2 portions of nuts, that's like 200 extra calories. Something else is going to change because you'll naturally therefore displace something else from your diet. And so it's all of these kind of factors. That's just a couple of examples of the kind of things that we have to think about, really hard when we're designing these studies. Who do we want to test those nuts in? do we want to look in perimenopausal women, premenopausal? Do we want to look at males? Do we want to look at females? What age group, etc.? There's so many considerations. And at the end of the day, one of the biggest challenges is money. And, getting research funding itself is really, really difficult. We have to be really competitive with how much we charge. So when we're applying for research funding from research councils and research bodies, we have to be very competitive in how we cost our trials. And so often that also really limits what we can do. And this is why as well, so many of the studies that I've run in the past have been in just men. Because in order to be competitive from a cost point of view, if I was to recruit males and females, I would have to charge more than double probably to run a study. And the reason is because if I'm looking at how a food or a nutrient or a dietary intervention impacts a female, I have to consider, are they peri or postmenopausal? I have to consider what stage of the menstrual cycle they're on and so forth. So I'd have to recruit a lot more women into that trial than I would if I was just to study men. And this is why historically, as well as other reasons, women have been quite traditionally understudied in science and particularly nutrition. Fortunately, it's changing. And all the research that we're doing at Zoe, actually, we're almost over-indexing on women, which is great.
That's really brilliant to hear. I will come on to some of the practical take-home tips that viewers can actually implement into their own lives. But scratching my own curiosity, what is your favourite piece of research that you've ever worked on?
Oh my gosh, that's really hard. That's like saying, who's my favourite child? When you run a study, at the time that you're running it, it's obviously your favourite because you're living and breathing it. I would say the work that I've done around the food matrix is probably the favourite research area. In particular, a study that I did looking at the food matrix, and food matrix literally means food structure. And it's really relevant to today, where all of the heavily processed foods that we consume typically have their food structure destroyed. So when we talk about ultra-processed food or food processing, I think automatically what comes to people's minds is additives, emulsifiers, and all these scary like E numbers. But actually what processing does is it changes the structure of food. And many years ago, I was looking at this in my research at King's, where I was feeding people, for example, whole almonds. So whole almond nuts, and then feeding them on other occasions ground almond nuts. So you destroyed the structure, you'd broken up all the cell walls. And in terms of the ingredients, you had two foods with identical ingredients. In terms of the nutrients, you've got two foods with identical nutrients. All you've changed is the structure of the food. But how you metabolize that, how many calories you absorb, and where you absorb them is totally different. So this research, for example, shows that by actually breaking down the almonds, so you're, destroying that structure, you absorb all of the calories. Yet if you consume the almonds in the original form, within its original food matrix, about 30% of the calories are excreted because of that structural element of the cell walls within the almonds. We also see a huge difference in the postprandial metabolic response, so the metabolic response that occurs in the kind of 8 hours after you consume the almonds. And we see differences in where you're absorbing the nutrients, in your hunger feedback signals, in your fullness signals, and so forth. And it's just by changing the structure. And so I'd say that's probably my favourite study, because it's like, wow, I don't think people think about that we're so obsessed with back-of-pack labelling and how much saturated fat and how much fibre. What does the food look like? Does that have the same structure?
So the ground almonds and the normal almonds, on a food packet label, they would have the same calories?
Yep.
Fab,
so exactly the same calories. And we've done similar studies, for example, with porridge, where we fed large porridge. So think of kind of big porridge flakes. And then we've taken them and literally just ground them, put them in a blender, fed those to individuals, and then looked at their postprandials, their post-meal blood sugar response. So looking at the levels of circulating glucose in their blood, which we call postprandial glycemia. And what we see is if you have the whole large porridge, you get a really balanced blood sugar response. If you grind it, you get a big peak, you get this dip, you get differences in fullness and satiety, you get differences in where it's absorbed. The larger porridge is absorbed lower down the gastrointestinal tract, where you have more fullness receptors. GLP, everyone's talking about them, you have more GLP released and so forth. Yet, if I was to put them into packaged food, identical ingredients, They're porridge. Identical nutrients, identical fibre, identical carbohydrate. Yet just because we've ground them, we totally change how our body handles them.
I'm extremely excited to talk to you about glucose spike, the minefield that seems to be ultra-processed food as well. I think there's a lot of misinformation when it comes to ultra-processed foods, but then a lot of really real fears that people have. I'm very excited to come on to those. But first, we've got a section called Buy or Bye Bye, where basically, I would say it's quite fun. I'm going to show you some products, and I would like to know whether you would buy these products or you would say bye-bye to them. Protein supplements.
Bye-bye.
Why would you say bye-bye?
Because we live in this time of protein obsession. We're all getting enough protein. We're getting more protein, most of us, than we need. There's very few people, and only in some very unique circumstances, maybe people who are, living with cancer, or some particularly elderly people who don't consume enough food generally. Everyone else, we're getting enough protein. Why do we need supplements? We can get all the protein we need from the food that we have without even over-focusing on whether that food is high in protein or not. So waste of time, waste of money, not needed. Oh, or if you're like some Olympic bodybuilder, maybe then.
Fabulous. Bye-bye. Oh, B12 supplements.
Bye-bye for the majority of people, but bye if you are vegan or vegetarian. Am I allowed to give both?
Yes, you absolutely are. I'm a big advocate for caveating and nuance because I don't think we have enough of it. Artificial sweeteners, big topic of conversation.
I'm going to have to say bye-bye. Can I give some context?
Absolutely.
I'm saying bye-bye because I think there's some good emerging evidence now showing how they disrupt the gut microbiome, they increase our risk of insulin resistance, might predispose to diabetes. They also create this desire for sweet stuff because typically they tend to be even sweeter than sugar. So because of that, I would say bye-bye. However, I think that the harms of having full sugar drinks and full sugar foods are actually also very bad for us. So I would say it with some caution that I wouldn't swap, for example, a Diet Coke for a full sugar Coke. I would try and avoid both of them. But I think that also we need to be aware that not all sweeteners are equally bad for our health. And again, this is quite an emerging area of research. There's some sweeteners that come from natural plant products like steviol that there doesn't seem to be yet any evidence to show that they're harmful for our health. In a year's time, there might, who knows? And then there's other sweeteners where there is some evidence like sucralose, ACE-K, aspartame, where there is some evidence they might disrupt the gut microbiome. So it does also depend on the type of sweeteners, but also the context in which you're having the sweeteners.
Brilliant. Processed foods.
Bye, as well as bye-bye. Bye, because not all processed foods are bad for us. The whole term ultra-processed food is so much more nuanced. And, cheese essentially is a type of processed food. It's gone through processing. And I think we've got to stop demonising anything just because it's got the word process, like seed oils. So many people demonise seed oils because they say, oh, it's gone through processing, yet butter's natural. Well, absolutely not. The evidence clearly shows seed oils are way better for us than butter is. But it's this kind of obsession with if it's natural, it's healthy. Lard is natural, but I hope every listener agrees, lard is so bad for us. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's better for us. Just because it's processed doesn't mean it's bad for us. Yes, there are some foods that are processed in such a way that the structure is destroyed. It's got loads of additives and emulsifiers that might not be good for us. Then I would say bye-bye. But we also have to remember that many processed foods are a lot cheaper than their unprocessed counterparts. So on average, we know that unprocessed counterparts of processed foods tend to be 50% more expensive. So we do need to think about affordability and accessibility. And many foods are processed to make them shelf-stable, safe, etc.
Fab. Red meat.
From a health perspective, I would say bye-bye. From a pleasure perspective, I would acknowledge that I like red meat. I am careful with how much red meat I have. It is linked to cardiovascular disease. It is linked to increased cancers, particularly colorectal cancer. So I would caution anyone about consuming it in excess. But once in a while, buy, but in bulk, do not bye-bye.
Brilliant. Low carb diets.
Bye. No, bye-bye. I'm getting confused now whether it's bye-bye to low carb diets. Generally, because I don't think we should follow any prescriptive dietary pattern. I think that healthy eating principles are quite simplistic. It's not rocket science. I think we should just have a balanced diet with balanced nutrients, with a mix of different foods. I think following, a high carb or a low carb diet, I think it's not necessary for most people. I would caveat, however, for people who have type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, there is quite good evidence to show that low carb diets do significantly improve some of their health outcomes. But it depends, again, it's that whole, by reducing your carb intake, what are you adding in when you take the carb out? And it's really important you're adding in like heart healthy oils, healthy protein sources, plenty of fibre. My worry with low carb diets is that many people will not get enough fibre on a low carb diet.
Brilliant. Really nice to have such a nuanced take. I think often on social media, we lack a lot of nuance, and there's certainly a lot of nutrition information that we see on social media, not all of it great. There's been a huge boom in awareness amongst glucose spikes.
Yep.
What are the basics of glucose spikes, and what are the take-home messages that you want people to know when they're navigating this world of where glucose spikes come up on social media quite a lot?
Okay, so I think the first thing I would say is don't be scared of carbohydrates. Don't be scared of glucose spikes. Remember, our bodies are clever. Our bodies have evolved to be able to handle carbohydrates. However, what we haven't evolved to be able to do is handle many of the types of carbohydrates that we're consuming. But that changes in circulating blood glucose are normal physiological responses to eating carbohydrates. So that's the first thing I'd say is, don't be scared. Just to give everyone a quick lesson, why do we get these increases in circulating blood glucose? Why do we get these spikes, as people call them? When you eat carbohydrates, carbohydrate is a nutrient. You have, the main nutrients you've got is protein, fat, carbohydrate, fibre. When you consume a carbohydrate-rich meal or a mixed meal, nearly every meal will have some sort of carbohydrate, unless you're literally just glugging olive oil. What happens is when we consume a meal containing carbohydrates, it's broken down in our bloodstream. Many carbohydrates, so starchy carbohydrate, sugar is broken down into its constituent smaller sugars, typically glucose. And what happens is you have an increase in blood glucose after you've consumed that carbohydrate. That typically peaks about 15 to 30 minutes after eating that carbohydrate, returns to baseline anywhere between like 1 hour to 2 hours after. It's a normal physiological response. Our bodies are well able to handle it. We release hormones such as insulin when we eat carbohydrates that then removes the carbohydrates from the circulation, puts it where it needs to go, whether it's in the muscle, whether it's back to the liver, etc. Now, what we do know, however, is that the food that we're typically consuming now is of what we call a refined carbohydrates, white rice, white pasta, white potatoes. And if we consume these on their own, so without protein, fat, fibre, you can have very big increases in circulating blood glucose. So it can reach quite high levels. And then what you can have also is what we call a blood sugar crash about 2 to 4 hours after having that carbohydrate meal. Again, there's nothing to worry about having those. But what we know is if it's repeated and excessive day in, day out, it can affect how you feel in the here and now, but it can also impact your long-term health. But there is on social media, and this is how you started the question, a lot of misinformation. And there are influencers who talk about flatlining your glucose. You do not need to flatline your glucose. We can handle, some changes. We don't want to be on a roller coaster. Absolutely, we don't. But it's fine to have some increases, peaks and dips in our glucose. I think where it becomes problematic is when it's impacting how you feel. And after a while, you actually become normalised to this. And sometimes really stepping away from refined carbohydrates and then reintroducing them into your diet allows you to see how it does impact you in the here and now. So what we know from our own research is what's particularly problematic is when you have this dip in circulating blood glucose. And so we see that if people are having refined carbohydrates and carbohydrates again on their own, so not having a mixed balanced meal, many people will get a dip in circulating glucose in that 2 to 4 hours after consuming that meal. And what we know is if you do have a dip, you tend to consume more food over the day because it triggers greater hunger. You tend to consume your next meal 30 minutes earlier. On average, people who have a dip consume 320 calories more over a day compared to people who don't have a dip, because you're in this kind of hypoglycemic dip. Now, not to the extent that would be worrisome from a pathological point of view, as in if someone has diabetes, but you're experiencing this low sugar that, you know, people experience it differently. You know, I get hangry, I get brain fog, I get a little bit shaky. And so like the hunger signals in my brain are like, Sarah, get food, get food, get food. You need a quick fix. So then I go and have more refined carbohydrates. So then I'm like this throughout the day. And we've done studies where we've taken people and on one day we've given them breakfast that causes them to have a dip. The next day we've given them a breakfast where we've got them to add like nut butter to their bagel or cheese, for example. And what we find is that on the day that they add some protein or fat to their meal, which prevents them from having a dip, they report better mood, better energy, better alertness, and actually go on to consume far less calories over that day because they're having a smoother response. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be scared of that peak and that dip. It just means balance out your meals. Listen to how your body's feeling. Do you feel you get that crash? And if you do, be cautious having carbohydrates on their own.
That really resonates with me. I think back when I would be maybe doing a shift and I'd wake up, maybe I'd be on call or whatever, and I'd wake up late, not have my breakfast, then get to the hospital and just be work, not be able to get a snack until like 2. And then 2 would hit, I'd be hungry. I'd just be like, I need calories right now as quick as possible. Go to the hospital canteen and I'd have my little chocolate picnic, the picnic chocolate bars.
Oh, yeah. I remember those.
Yeah, that was my favourite because in my head I was like, well, there's sultanas in there. That's surely like a little bit of goodness. Scoff that, and then crack on with the rest of my shift. And then by the time I got home, again, it was eat something as quick as possible, have the quickest, meal I possibly could, and then get to bed. How would you recommend implementing that on a day-to-day basis, from breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, to try and balance out those ups and downs?
Yes, there's no kind of sexy answer to that. And I'm not a dietitian, so I'm not used to kind of giving prescriptive, this is how you do it in terms of your foods. I can give you some broad ideas. One is the obvious, and I'm sorry to point out the obvious, is build your balanced meal. Make sure you're not just consuming carbohydrate on its own. Make sure there's fibre, healthy proteins, healthy fats. We see that makes a huge difference. How do you put that into practice? Do you like a bagel for breakfast? Fine. Can you add some nut butter to that? Can you add some cheese to that? Are there other sources of protein and fat? Can you add, squashed avocado and egg to that, for example? Now, some people say, oh, but hold on, I'm adding extra calories. Well, we've done studies again, and we've seen that even if you take that bagel and the next day, so one day, you have that bagel on its own. The next day with the bagel, you have a source of protein. So, for example, we've done a study where that person's had low-fat Greek yogurt, which is basically a very pure source of protein. And so although you're adding calories in, that person actually went on to eat far less that day when they added the protein into their meal than when they had the bagel on its own, because it kept their blood sugar more balanced, it kept them more energetic, it kept their hunger levels suppressed. So adding those sources of fibre, of protein, of fats. If you like oats, lots of people are scared of oats because, oh my God, they spike my blood sugar. Well, oats are a really healthy meal, but if you find they don't keep you full for long, because yes, you have that peak and you have that dip. I'm one of the persons, that has that. Again, I add nuts and seeds to my oats, and I have these pre-mixed, so it takes no extra time. I do the same nuts and seeds to yogurt. I add some nut butter. So it's just a case more of kind of, I think, what are you going to add into the meal, and not being scared that it's then giving you extra calories. In terms of your lunch and your dinner, it depends what kind of lunch and dinner you have. But again, it's about adding, I think, those heart-healthy oils in, protein sources. You cannot go wrong if you're having a meal that you're drizzling loads of extra virgin olive oil on. Don't worry about the calories, because you will end up eating less later in the day because it's keeping you full for longer.
I think that will be quite healing probably for a lot of women who have grown up with quite a lot of diet culture and restrictive mentality. And I personally find that when focusing on adding isn't just probably better for your health, but also better mentally. So think about all the foods that you can have rather than you shouldn't be having.
Yeah, and absolutely, when we think about snacks, for example, If you want to have that cake, just have that cake. Maybe go for a slightly smaller portion and have a handful of nuts with it. The nuts, again, you're getting lots of protein, you're getting lots of heart-healthy oils, and it's going to balance out the sugar from the cake, but you're still getting that fix that you want from that cake. You know, when I want chocolate, and I'm going to have that chocolate. And it's just a case of, okay, well, you know, you're not necessarily offsetting it as such, but to a certain element, you kind of are by adding in something healthy that's going to balance the blood sugar, but also give you lots of other healthy nutrients as well.
I think that did a really good job of giving us the basics past social media, but misinformation. So many of the questions were around social media, misinformation around nutrition and trying to navigate that landscape. What would you say are the biggest nutrition trends that you see on social media? And maybe which ones of them they are right to be trending, it is something to worry about, and which ones of them are just a load of, excuse my language, bollocks?
So I've termed the coin Nutribolics, which basically covers nearly everything you see on social media, except obviously what we put out on our Zoe podcast and my fellow colleagues
Fab.
put out. You know, and actually, to be fair, there are some good nutritionists and some good dietitians putting out good information, but the loudest voices, unfortunately, it is a lot of it's Nutribolics. I think the biggest Nutribolics is, or trend at the moment, is this protein trend. The other thing is seed oils, which I've talked about a lot and come under a lot of fire about. And then the trend that I think we're going to see emerging, I hope, over the next 12 months, and we're starting to see emerging, which is not Nutribolics, is fibre maxing. And so that's the one that I think would be amazing if we can get more traction on that. But this whole obsession with protein, this whole demonisation of seed oil, absolute Nutribolics.
We've got another section which is called Real or Real, where basically I'm going to show you a short form clip and I'd love to hear your opinions. Before I come on to it, I wanted to say about your point about seed oils. Every morning, my breakfast is I have my whole grain bread, nice. Like not refined carbohydrate, or sometimes like a whole grain or a sourdough, love a sourdough, and eggs on toast. It's the quickest, easiest way that I find it keeps me full, and I fry it in olive oil, you know?
And I think that's a great tip, going back to, you'd asked me about how can busy people also think about balancing their blood sugar because of refined carbohydrates. Swap from the white carbohydrate to the whole grain, white bread to whole grain bread, white pasta to whole wheat pasta. It's not as nice, I do get that, but you will become accustomed to it.
A good sourdough, though. When my boyfriend gets to the plain seeded, I'm like, oh God, but a good sourdough is quite nice.
White rice to brown rice.
Yeah.
Or just add in the protein, fat and fibre. Anyway, just wanted to add that as you were talking about your breakfast.
I have my breakfast and I did like a vlog of basically like my daily routine or whatever. And someone made a reaction video, and it was someone who advocates for a carnivorous diet, made a reaction video to this. In the beginning, I'm frying my eggs in my olive oil, and he was like, she calls herself a doctor, she's using seed oils, and yeah, it's just interesting how I feel sometimes these things can go hand in hand. What is the basics of the demonisation of seed oils?
So most of the messages that you see on social media are seed oils are toxic, seed oils are responsible for all modern ailments from cardiovascular disease to cancer to Alzheimer's. It's all because we're consuming seed oils. The evidence doesn't support that at all. Now, I do have to caveat it with the fact that about 60% of the seed oils that we consume in the UK and in the US do tend to come in heavily processed foods that are not healthy for us. But it's not the seed oils themselves that are unhealthy. It's the vehicle, it's the food that they're in that's unhealthy, that's got all this other crap in it that's the problem, not the seed oils themselves. And there's lots of arguments that the seed oil haters, as I call them, use to demonise seed oils. One is that, you know, as our seed oil intake has increased, which it has more than 200-fold over the last 50 years, so has our rates of all of these chronic diseases, like cardiovascular disease, like cancers. Well, just because our intake of seed oils has increased at the same time as that, what else has changed? Our food landscape is unrecognisable from 50 years ago. We can't just put it all on seed oils. It goes back to that whole thing that we talk about a lot in science, what's association versus what's causal. That's association, it's not causal at all. Then there's this idea that because seed oils are processed, they've gone through all of these scary processes. They've been bleached, they've been deodorized, they've had like hexane chemicals and all these awful chemicals. So of course they're bad for us because anything that's processed is going to kill us. And yet butter is natural. Think of that cow grazing on that, in that field, in that meadow, and, someone churning the milk to get the butter. So of course that's better for us. Just because something's processed doesn't mean it's bad for us. And all of the randomized controlled trials, which are kind of like our gold standard of research, consistently show that seed oils are better for us than butter, than lard, than beef tallow, these other forms of animal fats. And this is using seed oils that have gone through a refinement process. So this isn't using cold pressed seed oils that some people say would be better for us. And then the third main reason that people use to demonize seed oils is that they're pro-inflammatory. And that's what you hear about a lot. And it's based on the idea that the main fat in seed oils is a fat called linoleic acid. And it's a fat that fits in what we call the omega-6 family of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And what we know is that when you look at the kind of biochemical pathways, that linoleic acid, so that fat that's in seed oil, can be converted into a different type of fat called arachidonic acid. And I'm sorry to get technical, but it's quite important because, the seed oil haters use all of these clever words, to really kind of scare people. But it is quite simple. So this linoleic acid that's found, a fat found in seed oils, is converted to this other one called arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid under certain stimuli can release certain chemicals called eicosanoids. But basically these chemicals can act on pro-inflammatory pathways as well as lots of other pathways. However, whilst this looks beautiful on paper, whilst this may play out in a petri dish or in a mouse fed like super physiological amounts, this does not play out in humans. So very little of that linoleic acid, that fat that's actually in the seed oils, is ever converted to that other type of omega-6, that arachidonic acid. And what studies consistently show is that when you feed people high amounts of this particular omega-6 linoleic acid, or particular high amounts of seed oils, you do not get an increase in circulating inflammatory measures. It just doesn't happen. Yes, it might happen in a mouse. Yes, it might happen in a test tube, but it does not happen in humans. And that's because we have mechanisms in place such that we're not converting all of that to this other fatty acids, such that it's only when we need the inflammatory response are we releasing those inflammatory mediators, because we do need some inflammation.
Anti-inflammatory diets is a huge term that we've seen on social media, and I definitely want to come on to that. First, I will show you this video, and I'm very keen to hear your thoughts.
Here's what I eat in a day as a carnivore in New York. After a fasted morning workout, I had a breakfast of 8 scrambled eggs cooked in the fat of a pound of 80-20 ground beef. I had a cold stick of butter on the side to keep the fats up and the hormones happy. After walking 10,000 steps, I needed a quick snack, so I had a carnivore bar with this amazing cold brew I found. I was hungry again at around 10 p.m., so I cooked up some flat iron steak bites and had my favorite high-fat yogurt for dessert. What did you eat today?
Well, I hope they've got their cardiologist on call. And apart from the yogurt, which I am a real advocate for the health benefits of yogurt, fermented dairy we know doesn't increase cholesterol like other dairy. Yogurt a great example, cheese a great example. Cheese and yogurt don't have the same negative effects that butter does on cholesterol. And so, apart from the yogurt, oh my God, like that would be a bye-bye to her diet. And it's this... butter sticks. I mean, someone's told me about this. I haven't actually seen it on social media myself because obviously I don't follow these kind of people. But I mean, come on, eating butter sticks. The evidence is so clear that having butter increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. It increases your cholesterol levels. It increases your blood pressure, etc., etc. I mean, and where's the fibre in that? 95% of UK, US people are deficient in fibre. I mean, I don't know where she's getting any fibre in that. 8 eggs. Now, whilst we know that dietary cholesterol and eggs is a high source of dietary cholesterol, we know that dietary cholesterol doesn't increase cholesterol in the way that saturated fat does. Having more than 2 eggs a day, no, I wouldn't recommend that.
Brilliant. Okay.
It has a lot of cholesterol as well as a lot of saturated fat, as well as a lot of red meat. I imagine there's loads of salt in there.
It was biting into the butter that really physically made me cringe.
Oh my gosh, I know.
That was awful. I'd love to hear your opinion on something that I heard hypothesised, and I am not a nutrition expert. I want to caveat all of this by saying that, but I'd just love to hear your opinion. Say if there's these extremes where someone goes, say, maybe vegan, or they maybe go to a carnivore diet. in both of those diets, you eat unprocessed foods. And what this individual was hypothesizing on, something I was listening to, was that the benefits come from potentially maybe removing the unprocessed foods or the physical symptoms that people may feel when they see benefits from going on a carnivore diet. What are your opinions on that?
So I think there's 2 points there. One is the placebo effect. So the perceived benefit that you've said that people see from changing their diet. Absolutely. We know there's a placebo effect that people think, oh, well, I've seen this social media person say they feel great on that. I'm going to try it. Obviously, I'm going to feel great. And our brain is incredibly powerful. And so they might feel great. Then there is that whole big area of, okay, is it that actually they're just cutting out processed foods? But are they? You know, a lot of vegan diets tend to be, and vegetarian diets tend to actually be higher in processed foods. And, you know, it's really variable. A vegan and vegetarian diet is, you know, night and day, one to another. So there are some incredibly healthy vegan and vegetarian diets. But you can have a really shitty vegan diet that's full of all of these meat substitutes, milk substitutes. You know, some of the meat substitutes out there are so packed in salt, so packed in other additives and emulsifiers and all sorts of crap that you might as well be eating like, I don't know, you know, a piece of cardboard or something, or plastic. Now, there are some meat and animal substitutes that are healthy for us. I don't know specific brands, but I mean, that again is a whole big area where you've got a big diversity. And so I don't know the answer to what you've asked because it depends. And it's always that it depends in nutrition on what kind of vegan diet that person's following or what kind of carnivore diet that person's following. But what I would say is if that person's following a carnivore diet, even if none of the foods have been processed as such, you've still got a diet that could be very deficient in fibre, very deficient in plant-based bioactives. So plants have a really important role, not just in giving us fibre, which I think is one of the most important nutrients that we are nearly all deficient in. Plants have an amazing amount of chemicals. We know on average a food has over 50,000 chemicals. Many of those chemicals have magical properties almost. I mean, actually, I'm very cautious saying the word magical related to nutrition, but many plants have what I call bioactives. So these are chemicals like polyphenols. Polyphenols are chemicals that give plants their pigmented colour. So blueberries are really high in polyphenols. Polyphenols, you know, are amazing. They act on anti-inflammatory pathways. They act on oxidative pathways in a beneficial way. And so people following that kind of carnivore diet, they're not going to get any of that. So fine, they might be happy because they say, well, I'm not having additives, I'm not having emulsifiers. But what else are they not having? All of the good stuff as well.
I mentioned the rise in anti-inflammatory diets. Yep. What are your thoughts on anti-inflammatory diets?
So because it's a diet type, I think I would be kind of cautious to say, oh yeah, we should all be going on anti-inflammatory diet. I think we should all just eat balanced, healthy meals, have a little bit of a treat every now and then, you know, have minimally processed foods, have plant-based foods, have a diversity of foods, you know, have healthy oils, healthy protein sources, etc. It's boring. No one wants to hear that. Now, I could package that up as do you want a heart health diet? Do you want an anti-inflammatory diet? And what underpins an anti-inflammatory diet is exactly what underpins a general healthy, balanced diet, is what underpins the Mediterranean diet. Now, Mediterranean diets are a huge term because you've got all different types of diets within the Mediterranean. But what we classically think of as a Mediterranean diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, rich in very dark pigmented vegetables. So they've got, again, a lot of these polyphenols, rich in oily fish, which we know act on inflammatory pathways in a favourable way, low in processed foods, low in red meat and so forth. And so I would say that yes, there is a lot of evidence to show that low-grade chronic inflammation is a problem today because of our lifestyles, because of the foods that we eat, because of whether it's stress, whether it's the food, whether it's being sedentary, whether it's environmental toxins, etc. Yes, we know that low-grade inflammation is a problem and it underpins many chronic diseases from heart disease to cancers. So any dietary changes that we can make that minimise diet-induced inflammation absolutely will improve our overall health. But again, there's no silver bullet, and I don't think there's a magic anti-inflammatory diet that really differs from what I believe is just healthy eating principles.
Brilliant. I'm going to come on to some community questions. We had so many. I feel like navigating, as you've said, the nutrition landscape of today can be clearly really, really difficult for a lot of people. One of the community questions we've been asked is, does the order in which you eat macros during a meal matter?
This is a hard one, because what does matter mean? Yes, I think it matters to your pleasure. Like, when I want to eat my meal, when I'm having it at home or in a restaurant, I want to eat it in a way that brings me pleasure. So absolutely it matters. And so what matters to me is being able to just eat what I want, how I want, at the time I want from that plate. Does it matter in terms of what I think really they're asking, in terms of how we metabolize it and our health response? Yes, it does have an effect. And again, this is something that you see many of those glucose influencers talk about. Before you have your carbs, have your fat, have your protein, have your fibre. Why? Because it will slow down the rate at which your stomach empties. So it slows down the rate of gastric emptying. So it will slow down the rate that the carbohydrates appearing in your blood, or the sugar is appearing in your blood. And so you'll get less of a big peak. You're less likely to get a dip. But the size effect, in my opinion, is quite small. And so, for example, studies have looked at protein with a meal versus protein as a preload. And by preload, I mean having a protein source about 30 minutes before you have the carbohydrate in the meal. And yes, you might have a slightly greater suppression of the glucose response having it as a preload than having it in a meal, although studies are quite mixed on this. But actually, when you look at the actual data, the size effect is quite small. And this is something that I don't think we think about enough sometimes as scientists, but also as individuals reading stuff that, is on social media, is we can say something has a significant effect. And that's a statistical test. Is it significantly different by a statistical test? Is it significant from a health point of view is an entirely different thing. And so my view is that the order in which you have your nutrients or your food within a meal, yes, can impact how you metabolize it. But I would say the size effect is very small. And in my opinion, it's just not worth it. I mean, are you going to sit with, what's your favourite meal, for example? If you were to go to a restaurant.
Do you know what? I love mussels and just crusty bread. That's probably one of my favourite meals.
So if you were in a restaurant and you had a beautiful bowl of mussels in some lovely sauce or something. Yeah. Oh, okay. This is now giving me a craving. Yeah. And then you had your crusty bread.
Yeah.
Do you want to go in, and then let's say you've got a knob of butter as well. Are you going to eat that butter, then eat your mussels, and then wait, and then eat your bread on its own 10 minutes later?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah.
It ruins the pleasure. You want to dip that bread in the mussel sauce. You want to have a bit of mussels, a bit of bread with the butter. And food is there to be enjoyed. And I think this is the problem with what I call biohacking and some of these kind of hacks. That yes, there's science to show that the order and the time of day and this and that matters, but actually how important is it relative to the pleasure that you're getting?
Reminds me of majoring in the minors or putting sun loungers out on the Titanic, the idea of you're focusing in on this quite small thing. What's the point in focusing on what order you have your macros if, I don't know, you're not eating enough fruit and veg during the day? It
pales into insignificance. You're absolutely right. If you're not eating your plant-based foods, your fruits, your vegetables, your beans, your pulses, your nuts, your seeds, it's like 1% compared to 100%.
Yeah.
Like, why bother?
Yeah.
Do you know, if it makes you feel good and you feel more positive about yourself, I'm all for it. But I think it would be a pretty damn miserable meal.
Yeah, that would ruin my muscles. Absolutely ruin my muscles. Another question that we got about glucose spikes was, does eating vegetables and fibre first, again with the order, reduce glucose spikes?
As far as I'm aware, yes. I don't think there's been many studies looking specifically just at vegetables. I do know I looked into this some time ago, and I think there was one study that was out there that had vegetables before. Absolutely, fibre does. So we know fibre, protein, fat, absolutely. There's clinical trials showing if you have that before or you have it with a meal, yes, it does reduce your glucose spike. Fruits and vegetables are also quite high, particularly fruits, in sugars, can be broken down in part to glucose. So that's going to somewhat contribute to your glucose spike, but in a healthy way. So please do not avoid fruit because you're worried about your glucose spike. Again, I'd say it's a small effect. Yes, it happens.
Easy ways to increase fibre intake.
One very simple way is to take a fibre supplement. Ideally, we would get it from our diet. Absolutely. Food first, absolutely. The reality is that it is quite hard. It's quite hard to get what we should be getting, which is 30 grams, if you're not used to cooking the kind of foods that are rich in fibre, whether it's fruits, whether it's vegetables, whether it's beans, pulses, lentils, that sort of thing. So whilst as a nutritionist, nutrition scientist, we should always take a food first approach, let's be pragmatic as well. You know, if taking a fibre supplement, and there's loads of good fibre supplements out there that have a diversity of fibre, if that is your only way of getting fibre, it's better to do that than not at all. However, it is far better to get it from foods. The reason it's better to get it from foods and a diversity of foods is because fibre is not just one single entity. There's lots of different types of fibres. There's soluble, there's insoluble, and even within those, there's lots of different fibre types. These different fibre types impact our body in different ways. They feed different bugs in our gut. Some fibres increase certain bugs in our gut. Some other fibres increase other bugs in our gut. So we want a diversity of fibres. So having a food first approach where you're getting a diversity of fibre is going to be the best way, therefore, to get that diversity, that will improve your health. The obvious things are like nuts and seeds. Nuts and seeds are packed full of fibre. Pulses, chickpeas, beans, lentils, these are all great sources of fruits and vegetables. How do you incorporate them into your everyday diet? Swap your typical snacks with nuts or seeds is one great way. Sneak in beans or lentils, and pulses if you can. My kids will not touch beans, lentil, pulses. There's no way. Occasionally I'll sneak it in. So if I'm doing a spaghetti bolognese, for example, you can actually get some lentils, mash them all up and sneak it in that way. Because again, we've got to be practical, depending on who your listeners are. If like me, what I eat in the evening isn't what I would choose to eat. It's what my bloody fussy kids will eat. They say they're not fussy, but I tell you, when it comes to saying, okay, do you want this, this or this? It's like, no, I don't like any of that. And so it's really challenging if you've got kids as well to get many of these different sources. So it's a case of finding what works for you. Again, there's the obvious, which is swapping from white grain to whole grain. So white rice, white pasta, white bread to whole grain. Lots of people may not like the taste. Swapping from white bread to nut, the kind of nutty, seedy whole grain. Rye bread is packed. Adding to your yogurt some chia seeds, etc. All of these are really simple hacks that you can do. I'm probably not the best person to advise on this because being more the scientist than the kind of dietitian, but there are some fantastic people you can follow on social media that have loads of ways that you can increase. Dr. Emily Leeming, who is an incredible dietitian who I've worked with for many years. She's actually got a new book coming out all about fibre, specifically about how you can cook your favourite recipes and fibre max them. So I tried out recently a recipe that she did, which was one that my kids would have eaten, which was, oh my gosh, macaroni cheese.
Nice.
And she did a fibre boost version.
Wow.
So whilst I'm also always cautious pitching for books, I think it's so relevant to your question. She's got a book out, but you can follow her anyway on Instagram, Dr. Emily Leeming, packed full of recipe ideas for how to max out that fibre in really simple ways.
We'll have to put that in the description for the listeners. One last community question before we ask you the question that we've been asking all our guests. What are your opinions on apple cider vinegar for glucose spikes?
So the randomised control trials showed that if you have apple cider vinegar before having carbohydrates, on average, it does reduce your glucose spike. It does reduce your peak in circulating glucose. It varies massively from individual to individual. It varies depending on the dose. Is it a big enough effect to actually have a meaningful health effect? Probably not. I'd be more interested if it prevented that dip, because I think it's that dip that in circulating glucose we should be more worried about with the food that we're eating rather than the peak. If you like it and you can afford it and it doesn't impact about how you're eating the food, fine. But the majority of people I know who've tried it say it's disgusting, say that it then means that they have to wait. I don't know what the protocol is, but you do need to wait like, I think 10, 15 minutes before you go to have your carbohydrate. And then they're sitting and they've only just remembered, and then their meal's getting cold. No, I wouldn't bother. So I'm afraid my answer to nearly all your questions is yes, the science shows this. B, does it ruin the pleasure? And is the side effect big enough? And I think you have to balance those up.
Oh, 100%. Because I think we're all busy individuals, you know? Who has got the time to be saying, oh, God, I need to remember to take my apple cider vinegar shot, you know, and cook a nutritious, balanced meal and stay sane and, you know, keep every other plate spinning.
There's ways that you can have the same effect, but have added benefits. Add in that extra virgin olive oil. You're going to get all of those polyphenols. You're going to get all those heart-healthy oils, and you're going to blunt your blood sugar peak.
I'm going to have to replay this episode to my boyfriend because my boyfriend is gym orientated. And I think the gym orientated, it can fall into the calories in versus calories out mindset. So sometimes my favourite easy meal is beans, olive oil, just like seasoning, and then in a whole wheat pita. And when I've had the busiest day, I know that will take me 15 minutes and it will stop me from ordering a Deliveroo. That's like what I have when I'm just like, I cannot be arsed. And he saw how much olive oil I put in with my beans and he was like, what are you doing? So I'm going to have to replay this episode for him. It's been an absolute pleasure. The final question that we've been asking all our guests is, Professor Sarah Berry, what do you wish every woman knew by the time she was 25?
Well, as a 49-year-old woman, what I wish I knew when I was 25 years of age is that nobody really gives a shit about you, what you're doing, how you answered that question, how you walked into that room. And I wish for me, and I hope my now 16-year-old daughter at the age of 25 will not worry about what other people think. Everyone else is too busy living their lives. So it's not nutrition, but I think my most confident years and my happiest years in myself have been in my 40s, because I don't give a shit if someone thinks I said something stupid or my hair was extra frizzy that day, or, you know, I was inappropriate with that comment or whatever. Don't care.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant piece of advice to end on. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I know the listeners will also be very, very grateful as well.
Pleasure. This was such an easy podcast. I could carry on talking for ages. It just felt like we're having a nice conversation in the pub, except my glass of wine's not here.
No.